here. Hello and welcome to another Smaulgld live stream. And also welcome to the first episode of the Smaulgld Saturday Night Speculation Series. Tonight I'm going to present a scenario and outcome for gold and silver that you most likely have never considered and certainly haven't heard on other gold and silver channels. But first, let me make my pitch for donations. If you enjoy these Smaulgld live streams and YouTubes and BitChutes, please consider becoming a Smaulgld patron. It really helps me out. You can do so directly from the screen at patreon.com/Smaulgld, or please consider donating via PayPal or Bitcoin or Litecoin. And also, I have a link below if you'd like to donate Ethereum. Okay, so let's talk about, in our first episode of the Smaulgld Saturday Night Speculation Series, a scenario that you've never considered or heard of. Now, you've all heard scenarios tied into dollar collapse, COMEX default, credit freeze, game over, multipolar world, end game, game changer, hyperinflation, end of the dollar hegemony, end of the petrodollar, China to crush the dollar, the BRICS to crush the dollar, Russia to crush the dollar, the world to crush the dollar. You've all heard those. And subsumed in those scenarios are gold will skyrocket, silver will launch. You haven't seen anything yet. Okay, so all we've heard, probably for the last 8 years, constantly, every gold channel, every silver channel, not only has the assumption that it's game over soon and it's unsustainable, the dollar is going to collapse, hi Tom, hi Rod. We're going over the typical scenario in which gold and silver are expected to rise or skyrocket, and you've all heard them, and you've heard me mock most of them on this channel, and they're about dollar collapse, COMEX default, end of dollar hegemony, game changer, and so on. Something's going to happen. It's going to be bad, and what's going to be good, however, is you'll have protected yourself with precious metals. Well, tonight I'm going to present a scenario, the exact opposite of that, but with a very positive result for gold and silver. So if you will indulge me, I'm going to give a scenario, how I see it's possible what might happen. Now, the events that I'm going to outline may not happen, but let's just assume something along the lines that I'm talking about does happen, and there's a good chance that it would happen. But then the shocker will come as to what would happen to the price of gold and silver. All right. Let's say the U.S. economy continues to grow and improve. Wages improve, unemployment stays down. And let's say further, there's more positive economic news across the board. Let's say the Republicans win in 2018 and they are all pro-tax cut, pro-slashing regulations, pro-infrastructure projects. They want to pass more tax cuts, and there basically won't be obstructionists, and they may want to build the wall. They may want to spend money on things like that. And let's say further, during that time or before that time, the Mueller probe ends with a declaration that there was no Russian collusion. That'll take a lot of the wind out of the anti-Trumpers' sails if we see that. They'll still be against him, and they'll still make up stories why he's Hitler and whatever, but you'll see Trump's approval rating rise past the 45-50% and into 55-60% territory if indeed that were to happen. Now, before anyone gets all excited and say this will never happen, the idea is just follow along if it did happen, not the probability that it will or won't happen. Assume there's a chance that everything I'm talking about could happen. Okay, and let's say the United States continues to increase its oil production and continues to push its exports and continues to be and becomes the world's largest oil exporter. Let's also consider that the Trump tariffs actually have a salubrious effect, meaning that tariffs are reduced on U.S. goods, but that the United States actually grows its domestic economy. Let's also consider that during this time period, a lot of the infrastructure jobs, a lot of the work, people start not to go to college, start not to take out big college loans. And let's say that the next generation of the next 4 to 8 years, they don't take on debt. The younger people now have money to spend. They're in trades. They haven't spent all their time and money in college learning about social constructs. They've actually been out earning a living. Let's also say that Obamacare goes away and a free market healthcare system gets put in place. The cost of healthcare goes lower and people have more money to spend. There are lower premiums. And let's just say that the economy starts to hum along at a 5, 6, 7, 8% GDP rate. And let's say that the United States actually starts to have more manufacturing and starts to do well. All right. In that scenario, that is the exact opposite of dollar collapse, credit freeze, game over, multipolar world, game changer, hyperinflation, end of the dollar, crush the dollar, all that stuff. That goes out the window. Well, then you would say, well, as precious metal holders, we are screwed. Why? Because the whole pitch that's been made to you guys is that the reason you buy gold and silver is to protect yourself against these calamities, hyperinflation, dollar collapse, which is mathematically certain, and so on. Okay, well, let's further assume that my hypothetical is not ridiculous because we've seen how the global economy has managed to patch itself together and to live off each other's debt and not collapse. So let's just say that gets suspended another 5 or 10 years and that the United States becomes even more a cleaner shirt in the dirty laundry hamper and is actually growing its economy, it's reducing its debt. There's more tax cuts, fewer regulations, and people now have more money, they have more savings, and they have less debt. Sounds somewhat Panglossian, but let's assume that happens, and for the reasons, not necessarily for the reasons that I outlined. There could be other reasons, but that's just how I calculated how it might happen. Meaning that the U.S. economy could grow and there could be some real stimulus going on over the next 3 to, say, 8 years. All right. Well, in that situation, people would say, oh, well, there's no reason to hold gold. I hold gold for dollar collapse. I hold gold for game over, game changer. I hold gold for all these nightmare scenarios, credit freezing. I hold gold silver so I can barter during the collapse. Basically, every gold and silver come on is basically telling you need gold and silver to protect yourself. That's the reason, raison d'etre, as they say en français. That is the reason that you buy precious metals. There's no optimism in buying precious metals. They've gloomed and doomed you into buying precious metals, and that's it. And then they've convinced you that doomsday is on its way. It's not in question. It's a mathematical certainty. Everyone will tell you, you'll see, and that's why you need to have gold and silver. Now, in the example I just gave, well, what happens if over the next 3 to 8 years we start to get GDP growth of 7%, 5%, 4%, 6%, somewhere in a very large range that we haven't seen since basically the 80s, right? And we start to get that type of growth. And I mean real growth. I don't mean inflated growth because they mess up the numbers and they count things that they shouldn't count into the GDP numbers. Okay. you would think that's it, game over for gold. And then you would still have gold pumpers and silver pumpers telling you that the economic boom, which I presume would go on for 38 years, is unsustainable. It's destined to collapse. It's even bigger now, the bubble. You're going to hear that, if indeed my scenario takes place. Here's something that I don't want to say no one talks about. I don't want to give myself the idea that only I see this. But one thing I do know is I do look at things differently, and I don't just, there are hundreds of gold and silver channels out there that repeat the same story. Central banks are buying gold hand over fist. Gold backed yuan. When China backs its yuan with gold, it's game over. They all repeat it and they get thousands of views for it. Well, I'm looking at this differently. Let's say we do have this economic boom. One thing that people do not consider and do not know, because no one tells them on the gold pumper channels, they just cherry pick data and tell you whatever data that they have picked is good for gold or is good for silver. And no matter what data it is, it's good for gold. Rate hikes are now good for gold. When they were cutting rates, that was good for gold. Everything is good for gold. Everything is good for silver. They can't give you a piece of data without trying to construe it into being good for gold. Well, here's a scenario that is good for gold. Does anyone know, off the top of their head, what the biggest demand for gold is? You type it in the comments. What is the biggest demand for gold? Is it central banks? Is it industry? Gold eagles? Gold ETFs? What is it? Might shock people to know, and some people may know this, but it's not shocking that they know. Maybe they haven't connected the dots on it, but jewelry demand. Bingo, Nicholas Smith. Jewelry is 52% of gold demand. That's more than twice the amount for investment gold in demand. So, nope, not central banks. Central banks are about 9%. Jewelry is the number one segment for gold demand. It's twice the amount of investment demand. So, in a good economic time, people have more money, people are rich, they will buy jewelry. When you have discretionary income, you buy jewelry. In fact, if jewelry demand is twice the amount of investment demand, and the investment demand falls off because there's no collapse, the jewelry demand won't even have to increase by the same amount of the decrease, because it's already twice the size of the gold demand. Go one step further. Jewelry cannot be substituted by ETFs. You cannot say, well, we'll stop that. What they could try to do is they can tell people, you don't need 22 karat gold. You don't need 18 karat gold. You only need 14 karat gold. That might work to a little bit. But you cannot substitute physical gold jewelry demand with paper promises, with ETFs, with futures contracts. Try telling your wife or your future spouse that you have a future on her ring. Now, she'll get it in 3 months, maybe, if you stand for delivery for that ring. It's not going to work. You have to go out. You have to buy it. The demand has to be there for the jewelry. So gold demand, I think, in an economic boom would increase. Let's move over to silver. Does anyone know what the top use of silver by segment is for silver? Is it coins and bars? Is it silverware? Is it solar panels? Is it electronics? Is it jewelry? Well, the largest aggregate demand for silver is industrial use, which includes solar panels. Electronics is the bulk of it. But the amount for electronics is about the same as it is for silver. In fact, jewelry and silver are slightly higher in some years. But here's the thing about jewelry and silverware. Jewelry and silverware are twice the amount in 2017 as coins and bars for demand for silver. So in 2017, there was 130 million ounces of silver demand for coins and bars. But the jewelry and silver demand was 264 million ounces, which means in good times, people are going to buy more silver jewelry. Now, one of the reasons for the big increase in jewelry and silverware demand is because Indians and Chinese have become more wealthy in recent years. When you have a larger middle class, they then buy more gold and silver jewelry. So if the United States were to go through, remember the United States has not had a really good 10 years. The rich have had a good 10 years, but they can't buy all the gold and silver jewelry. There's only so much of it they can buy. The average middle class person has seen wages stagnate, so they don't have money to buy gold and silver jewelry. So what happens is, if you have a real economic boom, where wages are rising, like you've had to a certain extent in India, and certainly definitely you've had an increase in standards of living and disposable income in China and India over the last 10 years, that's led to their middle classes buying gold and silver jewelry. Americans don't have the money for that. The rich do, but they're not buying that. I mean, they may buy it, but there's such an insignificant number of them that they're not going to be buying costume jewelry, 14-karat gold. They're not going to buy it en masse. So the idea that I'm putting across has some historical backing. I did just come up with it. Then I went back and I tried to find a period where we had this scenario and what happened to gold and silver prices. But also, if you think if people have more savings, one of the things I hear people say, they stop buying gold or silver because they don't have any more money left. Well, after you get done with your savings, you could be saving in gold and silver. Some people may still continue to do that. So if you are a silver stacker and you come across, you're getting better wages, you're getting more money, you might buy more gold or silver. That's definitely true. And then after you get past your savings, your disposable income may go towards gold and silver jewelry or other types of adornments. People may even start buying silverware again because, there's health benefits in silverware. It's antibacterial. You don't have to clean it as well as you do to worry about having bacteria on the silverware. So the point is that in an economic boom, like we've had somewhat in India and China, jewelry for both gold and silver demand goes higher. Now, when did we ever have this in the United States? Well, you can't count the price of gold or silver from 1933 to 1974 as indicative of anything. They had the price fixed set at $35 an ounce, and you weren't allowed to buy it. So forget that period. The period that the gold and silver channels latch onto, and that's where they get the analogous game over, dollar collapse, COMEX default, game changer, all that nonsense. Well, it's not nonsense, but where they got that from was from the period of 1975 to 1980, when the United States dollar really was threatened. The dollar had gone off the gold standard in 1971, and gold did skyrocket in the 70s. Inflation skyrocketed in the 70s. Why? Lots of debt, slowing economy, reliance on foreign oil. The United States was a mess. We had the Jimmy Carter years, malaise, and the prices of gold and silver during those time periods, during a very bad economic time, stagflation, near hyperinflation, you had no economic growth, you saw the price of gold and silver rise and investment demand rise. People lining up around blocks to buy, around coin stores to buy their gold and silver. Now, people attach that as the only reason why gold and silver ever go higher and will skyrocket is when the dollar collapses and the dollar hegemony ends and the petrodollar ends and China crushes the dollar, multipolar world, game over, game changer. The same mantra. Economic, unsustainable, Ponzi scheme, all that stuff. But let's say we have, as I outlined, economic growth, which might be more likely than these collapse scenarios. And I think what's scaring people off right now to gold and silver is they're thinking maybe the collapse won't happen, and therefore I don't think there's any upside in gold and silver. And then some people just will never give up the collapse scenario because it's been drilled into their head so much that they think there has to be a collapse, and therefore they've got to be in their bunker with their stack. But as I said, what if that doesn't happen and actually the U.S. economy, just the U.S. economy, maybe the world economy, catches a bid and starts to take off? Well, as I mentioned, that's going to create demand for jewelry, which is already double the amount in silver. Jewelry demand is twice the investment demand, and it's also twice the gold demand. So 52% of gold demand is jewelry, about 25% is investment demand. In silver, 264 million ounces a year on jewelry and silverware, and 130 million ounces on investment. Now the rest goes to industry. Now also, in an economic boom, what happens to industry? They need more silver. More electronics get built, more solar panels get built. So you're going to start to see a demand for silver in the industrial area, certainly in the jewelry area if people have more disposable income, and even in the investment area because people will have savings. So all the stackers who can't buy now because they don't have the money will probably have, in the aggregate, more discretionary income. So you may have greater silver demand across the board, not just the canceling out of lower investment demand replaced by higher jewelry and industrial demand. You may actually have an increase in savings demand in gold and silver. But right now, all the channels, all they talk about is, and the only reason to buy gold and silver is the collapse. And they've married themselves to the collapse story. It's based on what happened to gold and silver in the 70s. It's based on what happened to gold and silver right after the financial crisis. That gold and silver are going to do well when we have a collapse, and a collapse is always just around the corner. It's imminent. Now, let me give you the period of time in the United States when gold and silver actually rose. From 1984 to 1987, the United States had some very solid growth. It went from 7.3% GDP growth in 1984, 4.2% in 1985, 3.5% in 1996, 3.5% in 1987, 4.2% in 1988. Now, what happened to the price of gold from 1985 to 1988? No one has ever focused on, again, I don't want to say no one. People don't focus on the price of gold from 1985 to 1988. They focus on the price of gold from 1975 to 1980. They focus on the price of gold when it was in the wilderness from 2000 to 2008. They focus on the price of gold from 2008 to the current date. But little known, or not widely known, I mean, it's out there, it's a fact that's not hard to find, but no one focuses on it. The price of gold rose 70% from 1985 to 1988. And that was during a period of time of solid economic growth and no concern about game over, dollar collapse, end of dollar hegemony, rise of this. There was not that concern. Anyone who lived through the Reagan periods, especially from the period when he started campaigning for more in America in 1984 through even after the stock market crash, that was just a blip. Up until the Iran-Contra period, the United States was on a boom. In 1986, you had the centennial of at the Statue of Liberty, the bicentennial of the Statue of Liberty. It really was a time of economic growth and rising wages. And yet, the price of gold and silver rose. So, my point is, I believe it's possible. Remember, this is the Smaulgld Saturday night speculation series, first episode, is that it's very possible that in a period of economic boom, and I've given you one example in the United States that the price of gold and silver can rise, and I'll also give you that part of the rise in the price of gold and silver and part of what's underpinning the prices right now are the rise of the middle classes in India and China with extra discretionary income. Imagine if the U.S. People in the middle class started to have more money and started to buy more gold and silver. Because as I mentioned, you cannot play games with the jewelry. Someone mentioned you can lower the content in the jewelry. I mentioned it too. Also, you can make plastic jewelry, but you cannot substitute it. You can't do ring ETFs. You can't do necklace, COMEX contracts, and so on. So, point being, it's open for discussion that we don't need a collapse situation for gold and silver to rise. And in fact, if the economy does do well, that may not mean that you don't want to have gold and silver. You may not want to have it as insurance, but you may want to have it because if you have a rising economy, you may have some type of price inflation. And if a lot more money is chasing the same amount of gold and silver, then those prices may rise. Anyway, that's my speculation for the evening. Let's go back and take a look at some of the comments and see what you guys think. Hello, Tom. Hello, Rod. Nicholas guessed correctly. The number one demand for gold is jewelry, and jewelry is twice the demand that silver is twice the demand. Silver jewelry is twice the demand for silver coins, rounds, and bars. Matthew Rhodes, there are no new worlds to conquer, no new worlds, no new resources, no new technology. The fight from here up before what is left. The current economic arrangement is nearing its end. You know, that theory has been around for well over 150 years. People underestimate human ingenuity and human innovation. Tom says silverware. Well, silverware they count as part of a jewelry demand, but most of that silverware is really just in India. Culturally, Americans don't buy silverware anymore. When you get married, you don't get a silver set. Boomers have passed on their parents' silver sets, sold them. But you may see a resurgence in that just as people get wealthy. Maybe there'll be a movie about some dinner party and they're using silverware and everyone wants to run out and get silverware. Nicholas Smith, in countries like the Philippines, the pawn shops ubiquitous gold, silver jewelry is very liquid. Right, and you don't have that here because there's really not the same demand for gold and silver. But you may look, we don't have the demand, we haven't had the demand in this muddling period. You might have the demand if there is a better economic times. People may figure the best thing to do, especially with costume jewelry, you wear a silver necklace or a ring a couple of times. You want to go get some more, you go to the pawn shop or you go to the local jewelry and you just turn it in and get another one, or you just buy more. Tom Manley, silver percentage of silver content is being diluted in India. And that's going to be an issue anywhere. But, in India, they have this hallmarking program where they have to mark, and they have it in the United States too, in jewelry, whether it's sterling silver 92.5 or whether it's, I know in Asia, some of the jewelry is 22 karat gold. That's really unheard of here in the U.S. and in England. They go as low as 9% or 9 karat gold in some places. But still, you have to use gold. Flight 19, I use plastic. All right. Nicholas Smith, in Taiwan, the gold shops are all over. They too make gold almost too easy to use. JR Innovations, gold will skyrocket in the next economic downturn. Yes, that's at the top of the show I mentioned. That is I wouldn't say it's the conventional wisdom, but it is the repeated echo chamber wisdom of all the gold and silver channels, that there's one outcome, and it is dollar collapse, game over, game changer, end of dollar hegemony, the whole gloom and doom situation, unsustainable, Rothschilds, Ponzi scheme, end of the petrodollar, China to crush the dollar, BRICS to crush the dollar. Yes, and all that's going to happen, and your gold is going to go higher. That is the standard story. The purpose of tonight's Smaulgld Saturday Night Speculation series was, what if that doesn't happen and the opposite of that happens? What would happen to the price of gold and silver? And I think I argued somewhat cogently that it might be quite reasonable to assume that demand for gold and silver jewelry and demand for silver for electronics and even investment gold and silver demand may increase and drive the price higher. And I gave the example of during the Reagan years how the price of gold rose about 70% in 3-year period, and silver actually doubled from 1985 to 1987, then fell back a bit, but still over that 3-year period grew about 30%. So there is an argument to be made that good economic times can be good to gold and silver. As Tom Manley says, yes, gold is a win-win. You don't have to attach yourself and to a negative scenario where the only way gold goes higher is the whole world loses. And actually, that's not a good scenario to live through anyway. Ask anyone who's in Venezuela if they preferred life 7 years ago when things weren't that bad, or they like it now just because they happen to have some silver coins around their pockets. When you have bad economic times, the gold and silver don't do as much good as you might think because there aren't the goods and services available in the same as when there's good economic services. Also, you become a target. You're the only rich guy on the block. Whereas if everybody's rich, it's a difference. It's probably a much better feeling that if the world is doing well, at least the country's doing well, and you have gold and silver and you have jewelry and it's going higher, maybe that's a better world. I'm not saying one or the other is going to happen. I'm saying that it is just as conceivable that the economy can get better, and it's also conceivable if the economy does get better, that demand for gold and silver jewelry and investment demand and industrial demand would rise, and the prices might rise as well. Bitcoin is done. Futures contracts is flight 19. Could be. Share innovation. Bitcoin will collapse. Is already collapsing back down to fair value. There is no such thing as fair value for Bitcoin. There is no fair value for Bitcoin. Tom Manley, stick a plastic fork in it. Now let's stick a sterling silver fork in it, Tom. Matthew Rhodes, there is very little, if any, real growth in the U.S. and Europe. It all went to India and China. The only thing growing in the world is population. That's somewhat true. And in my scenario, part of that reason is the global economic policies did indeed shift a lot of the industrial growth to the east. China definitely took on that mantle, and they've also continued with it by issuing debt. The United States could. See, a lot of these things, while they may not make long-term economic sense, they may be artificial, you can create an economic boom, just like China did, using less than free market policies. And it's very conceivable that the United States, with the tariffs, with the tax cuts, could actually grow. It may not be, quote, long-term sustainable, and they'll still be maybe adding debt. That's not the point. China's adding debt like you can't believe. That doesn't stop the people from enjoying the benefits, whether it's phony or not, of a middle-class lifestyle that they didn't have, and that actually gives them the ability to buy gold jewelry and silver jewelry. Same with India. Central banks and wealthy elites flock to gold. No, actually, central banks don't. That's another story that you hear. The only central banks buying gold are basically the gold producers and Turkey. The other central banks are not buying gold, have not added gold. Switzerland sold 60% of her gold in 2000. The UK sold about 60% of her gold in 2000. The only ones that are buying gold are Russia, because Russia is a gold producer. Kazakhstan, which I reported on today, which is also now an increasingly large gold producer. They now passed the United Kingdom in gold reserves. So Russia and the Kazakhstan both are adding about 60 to 75% of their domestic mining supply straight into their central banks. And why are they doing that? Because the Kazakhstan tenge and the Russian ruble are not strong currencies. So they want to back up their reserves with gold. Same with Kyrgyzstan. But they're so small, they only have 8 tons of gold. Kazakhstan now is about 314 tons, Russia 1,942. They're not buying gold. That is just, all they're doing is aggregating Russia with the others and saying they're net buyers of gold, whereas before Russia started on its gold buying binge about 4 or 5 years ago, none of them were buying gold. So, and central bank gold demand, when you include all the central banks, is less than 10% of gold demand. The real gold demand is what goes into India, and it really, as we said at the top of the show, over 52% of gold demand is jewelry. The rest is investment demand, and banks are way down. Central banks are at about the same amount as industrial gold use. There's a lot of industrial use for gold that people don't realize. It's not as small a percentage as you would think. Cut out debt and inflation, and there's no growth. That's exactly what's going to happen to China. China can't continue forever. No country can continue forever, as the story goes. But there's nothing saying the United States can't cut more taxes, borrow money, do infrastructure stuff, flip around some of the tariffs, and have a period of growth. It's anything is possible, because no one would have thought that 10 years of this debt Ponzi scheme was possible. So I'm just saying that instead of sticking to a narrative and repeating it like a mantra, maybe think that something else is possible. And the two things I'm saying might be possible are the United States could have economic growth, and economic growth might be good for gold and silver because it could increase demand for jewelry and industry and possibly even investment. All right. My family, let's see where we are. JR Innovations. Economy was roaring in 1980s. Banking system was stable. Gold was not needed. You're right. Was not needed under the game over, game changer, dollar collapse, end of dollar hegemony. However, gold rose 70% during that time period, probably because people were rich and they were buying gold. Remember, most people, the average person, you ask them, do you own gold? Do you own silver? They don't. Ask them if they have any interest in owning a gold ring, an engagement ring, or a necklace. They will. There's a greater demand for jewelry when people have more money. See, the problem that stackers have is they think that the only thing people want gold or silver for is to stack it for game over and game changer and end of dollar hegemony. There's other reasons that people want gold. The whole reason gold became money in the first place wasn't because it was divisible and chopped. It was because the first thing initially was that it was desirable, that people wanted it. That was the main reason. And then they realized, and we can cut it into pieces and we can hand it around. Gold wasn't money first. Gold was interesting for people to have. Kings wanted it not to have in bars. Of course, they might have cast it into bars, but it was for adornment. It was the best. It was easy to work with, more for the goldsmiths. So when you say gold wasn't needed, yeah, gold wasn't needed possibly as an investment vehicle. But my point in this whole speculation series this Saturday night is that people want gold for other reasons, and the demand for gold for other reasons is larger than the demand for gold in a bunker and game over and game changer and dollar collapse and hyperinflation and the rest of it. Tom Manlitz, when he started buying gold in 1986. My family did the same in the 80s and 90s, but today everything is stagnant. Yep. And fiasco wrecked the banks. People went to gold. I'm not denying that gold, there is historical precedent for that too, that gold will do well in a collapse. I'm suggesting that there may not be a collapse, or at least not in your lifetime, and that gold could still do well if there's not a collapse and there's actually an economic boom. Manish Patel, I agree with what you say about gold and silver. Yes, the guys pumping gold, silver say it's going to stretch to the roof in the short term. It may not, but this is a physical stuff, and all you can do is buy more of the physical. As the prices collapse, you're buying something that is priced almost at the cost of production, and it goes down if you buy more. Also, I would be interested in the silver demand in India as they expand their wars industry. They've been building up their war industry under the Modi government. Yeah, Indian silver demand, Manish, if you want to go to the Smaulgld site, I have a section on Indian gold and silver imports, and I cover them pretty much monthly. At the beginning of this year, I've only done the first quarter, but still, you have all the numbers there. Indian silver demand is way up. Gold demand fluctuates. There's always gold demand there, but that's more dependent on government goods and services tax, import duty tax, and whether the government is trying to clamp down on gold. They seem to leave silver alone for the most part, and that silver demand is moving higher. Now, as to the cost of production, that's another thing that people throw out. First of all, the cost of production at the large gold mines, I looked on their websites, the cost of a gold equivalent ounce is about $800 for the largest gold mine. So they're well above the cost of production. But even so, even if they have to stop producing, because let's say gold falls to $700, that doesn't mean that gold becomes rare, because here's another fact people don't know, that gold today, the production is about 2,500 tons a year. But that's a very small amount of the overall gold. And in India, for example, a good portion of gold demand is satisfied not just by imports, obvious, because they don't have domestic mining, but is satisfied by secondary supply. And if there is no physical supply, or there's less of it, then it gets met with secondary supply. And it does move the price higher because people will want to charge a higher price. So JR Innovations, exactly. Gold and silver are beautiful to look at. Women love gold and silver. Now, JR Innovations, you might have caught this before. I've talked about it. Silver Fortune's talked about it. Salivate Metals talked about it. But I've won the battle, or I win the prize. My audience, at least according to YouTube, is 100% guys. Now, I know that's not true because I have interacted with women on these live streams, and also I get comments from women. But the point being is, yes, but for the most part, the gold and silver investment demand comes from guys, but the jewelry demand comes from both sexes. Matthew Rhodes, I remember 17 years ago at Kroger, people were starting to use credit cards, debit cards to buy food. Yes, I remember that. At the time, it looked like the craziest thing ever. Now a whole generation thinks it's perfectly normal. It's a very good insight. I always thought somebody was weird if they, it was almost like the people today that the old lady said, take out a checkbook. I said, what are you doing? Well, don't you have a credit card? But I remember when the credit card, I used to work in a grocery store, and I remember I used to make change. I used to hit the buttons, you had to push them in, push the thing with your palm, and then the thing came out, and it didn't tell you how much change you had to give them. They give you $28, and their groceries are, $24.16, and you had to figure it out on the fly. And it was all cash. I never thought you'd see the day where people, to me, credit card was like for rich people who would want to buy like a stereo, LP set or something. Ron Penner, do we believe the story about Mexico having 5 years left of silver to mine? I don't. There's always more silver. There's, again, innovations. There's always a way to find more minerals at what price. I've been hearing silver shortage is another one. I mean, when I say dollar collapse, end of dollar hegemony, credit freezing up, end of the petrodollar, protect yourself. Silver shortage is another one that comes up all the time. Running out of silver, commitment of traders, never happened before. I mean, you have to go with the idea that, yes, all resources on Earth are limited. There was one going around about 10 years ago that silver would be extinct by 2012. The first element on the periodic list. It doesn't go extinct. It goes, it may not be available in the Earth's crust. But I don't think that's even possible because there's so much gold and silver in the ocean, not just under the ocean floor, but in the ocean. But it's just a matter of how you get it. There's silver and gold and meteors. There's silver all over the place. It's really the cost of extraction. So I believe it in a certain way, but I don't believe the consequences of there not being a robust amount of silver coming out of the ground in Mexico as being that impactful. Partisan Gorilla, silver use and demand is industrially spent. Gold will be plentiful. This is the big swear stuff. Silver tech will be multitude using. But do you know? See, the thing, okay, what part, let me read. I shouldn't just read it for my own benefit. I'll read it for your benefit. Partisan Gorilla says silver use and demand is industrial spent. Let's just cover that first of all. Yes, it's industrial spent. It can also very easily be industrially recovered, and increasingly it is. The only reason it's not is if the cost of recovery is too expensive. So if it costs a few dollars to recover it, they will. If it costs $10, they won't. But if the price goes higher, they will pull all that silver out and they can recover that silver. Silver tech will be multitude uses higher throughout time. Silver will catch up to gold price. Absolutely not. First of all, the same technology, the same electronics that use silver also use gold. In fact, gold is better. It doesn't conduct electricity better than silver, but gold actually doesn't tarnish, and therefore it's better for things, for higher end products that have to last a long time. But the thing that people don't realize about, they just spout generalities. They don't have the numbers in front of them. They just say more uses for silver means higher prices, or solar demand is skyrocketing, so therefore more silver use, not mentioning, understanding how much silver would be required for solar. Oh, electronics, more and more electronics. Since 2010, the amount of silver demand for industrial electronic use has gone down, way down. You say, well, that doesn't make sense. We're using more electronics. Yes, they're using smaller electronics. There's far less silver in a cell phone than there is in some stack that you used to have as your computer on the floor under your desk. So the idea that silver is somehow just going to be so indispensable. Remember, all of these zinc, copper, tin, they're all indispensable. They're all required. They're all can be used. It's how much of them are to be used. And the thing about silver is the demand for electronics has gone down, not up. Check it with the Silver Institute. It has not gone up. Solar panels. While solar panel installation has, quote, skyrocketed, the amount of silver that they use in the panels has not. Because they've learned how to use less silver in the panels. They've also figured out, if they have to use aluminum. They've also figured out how to use nano silver particles for a lot of industrial applications where they used to have to use full on silver. So a lot of also the new applications in medical are for nanoparticles, same with gold. So they're figuring out how to use less silver. Eventually they can use graphene if they have to. The point is that when people pump a story, they only tell you generalities. You have to look at the specifics. So when people are pumping silver to the detriment of gold, they're only going to tell you the good stuff about silver. They're not going to tell you anything about gold. When people pump gold over, you can't pump one over the other, one versus the other. You have to look at everything. All right, Ron Pannard. Everybody gets their picture taken to gold, both packed to the rafters with gold, but Munkin chose that his picture taken holding a single bar and nothing else. Well, that's another story that may or may not be true, and really what difference does it make? I mean, if the United States wanted to buy 2,000 tons of gold, it could easily print up the money on the secret, run around and buy the gold. There's that much gold floating around. If you look, India imported 900 tons last year, 500 tons the year before, 1,000 tons the year before. In a few years, and the price went nowhere during that time period. If the U.S. wanted to build its gold reserve, let's say somehow they sold it all, which is what the conspiracy theory goes, they could buy it all back. It doesn't cost that much. Russia's gold hoard, 2,000 tons, cost $80 billion. So that story, again, is selective to make you think that, oh, they don't have any gold. What's going on? Better get some gold myself. They stole it. That's speculation. And even if you speculate it to its logical conclusion, it still doesn't mean anything. Canada has no gold. What does that mean? That Canada is not a country, but Canada has a AAA credit rating. The world doesn't run on gold anymore. People don't understand that. But even if it did, the Fed, if it 1 month the QE could buy all of Germany's gold, the 3,300 tons that they have. If you wear your wealth through customs, that's easier to explain than having bullion. That is absolutely true. If you try traveling with rolls and stuff like that, you're going to be asked, where'd you get it? Why do you have it? Who gave it to you? What are you going to do with it? Tom Manley, Swiss refiners are backlogged in production, delaying delivery to August. They cannot make kilos of gold fast enough. Yes, but you know why that is, Tom? It's because the Chinese like the kilo bars, and it has to be recast from other bars. So it takes some time, and it's a refinery bottleneck. You know, I equate that to a hamburger shortage versus a beef shortage. Let's say you're at a picnic, and it's supposed to be for 500 people, and they run out of hamburgers, not because they've run out of hamburger meat, because the guy making them into hamburgers isn't fast enough. That's all that means. So I wouldn't read too much into that. And noise, is political unrest in South Africa a threat to the world gold supply, other PMs? You know, it used to be. I've studied the CIA reports from 1966, 67, 68, 69, 70, 71, when the U.S. was on the gold standard. The supply of gold from South Africa was of geopolitical importance to the point of top secrecy. They used to do classified memos on it because you needed to know what South Africa was doing. It was like Saudi Arabia with oil. It was the free world's #1 place for gold production. And since gold was money, at least to central banks at the time, it was during that period of time. When the U.S. was on the gold standard, it was Russia. And they were very concerned because they couldn't tell how much gold Russia was producing at the time. They just had no way of knowing. So they would try to find out, and South Africa was a significant geopolitical importance during that time period. Since then, it's of no importance for a number of reasons, but the main reason is their gold production has gone way, way down. I don't even think they're in the top 10 anymore in gold production. They've got internal problems. They had a lot of strikes. So South Africa is no longer, whatever happened in South Africa to its gold mining has already happened. So that's no longer an issue. Minesh Patel, if you see Australian Mint's balance sheet, they're borrowing gold to manufacture it, and they have no stock. Interesting. I haven't. Are you talking about the Australian Mint because they don't make any gold? Or are you talking about the Perth Mint? That's possible because there is extreme demand for physical gold in India and in China. And also, if you look at the Perth Mint, which is a small mint, the amount of gold and silver that they sell is now higher over the last 14 months than the U.S. Mint. Now, if you talk to bullion dealers in the United States, they're not selling more Perth Mint products than U.S. Mint products. They're selling very little Perth Mint products and just a bit more U.S. Mint products. Those items are just probably going to being shipped to Asia. JR Innovation, the next Bitcoin collapse will destroy confidence. It's happened 4 or 5 times. I don't know. Maybe H1 could be the big one, and that's the end of it. But Bitcoin has made many drops. It's the only evergreen bubble that I've ever seen where it drops 90%. And you think, well, that's the end of it. And then it comes roaring back. Will it do that again? Not predicting it. It could. The only reason I say it could is it's happened before. Single cell organism, I short GC on CME frequently. Chart-wise, I'm predicting minimum 1240 and possibly a plunge to 11. Yeah, it's possible. Bitcoin is forked up, says Light 19. The one fork. Angela Morris says that's right. I'm sorry, I don't know what that's right, but I'll have to agree with you if it's something I said. Matthew Rose, if anyone remembers when the Gold Eagle was introduced, right, 1986, there was a lot of hype around it. You know what? Why they introduced the Gold Eagle? It was part of Ron Paul and Lou Lehrman's. They did a study for Ronald Reagan on what's called the Gold Commission, and when the United States, when Reagan first got in, could not get out of the economic funk, they were thinking about going back to a gold standard because the dollar was crushed, and during the Carter years, they still had inflation, even though they were ratcheting up interest rates with Volcker. And so they looked into a gold standard, and I guess the consolation prize was they were going to mint gold and silver American Eagles as part of the plan. That was the only part of the plan that survived. Eventually, as you know, the United States did not go back on the gold standard. There was all kinds of hype around. It was on the news, the radio, the TV. Yes, and Matthew, if you also remember, it was gold that was the big deal. Silver Eagles were not a big deal. At one point, they were selling like 2, 3, 4, 5 times the number of Silver Eagles to gold, which is basically nothing because silver was cheap. It wasn't until the 2008 period where you started really selling lots of Silver Eagles, 2011, 12, 13. 2015, they sold 47 million. 2014, if my memory is correct, they sold well over 100 American Silver Eagles to each 1 ounce American Gold Eagle. Replacing the use of lead and electronics with silver. No, I don't think they can do that. Maybe I should say the price of copper will catch up with silver. Copper, copper is money. Period, if you want to say it that way. Copper's been money for a long time, still is money. There's copper in a nickel, there's copper in a quarter. Copper is definitely divisible, it's useful. It's useful in its own right. It's not a bad-looking metal. So when people start pumping silver as if it's like, I don't know, like it's religion, you can form a religion around copper. Copper seal, copper bullet, whatever. Canada has 60 fighter jets and 20 tanks. That's not very impressive, right? Partisan Gorilla, food is the future gold. That's true. Water, too. See the commodity prices across the board. The strongest winner is food connected. Tom Manley, central banks and the 1% are said to be buying the kilobars. Yeah, the kilobar is better than they're smaller. And Angela Morris admits, I am a woman. Flight 19, Tom, that's right. Russia, China, and the Slovak country. Okay. All right, looks like we're at our last comment here. Tom Manley, they say that the price will go down, encouraging more purchase of gold, locking in the low prices on future delivery. You see, once you get into this COMEX future stuff, it really messes with the physical markets because You can short sell, you can trade without having, you can have certain amount of collateral. It's not the same as a market where you have to have the cash in hand to buy or sell. But all right, well, I want to thank everyone for joining me tonight in the first episode of Smaulgld's Saturday Night Speculation Series. Thank you very much, and we will be on again every night at 8 o'clock if you'd like to tune in. Thanks for joining.